Who's muting?
Okay, one of us will deal with it.
And you guys are looking at comments and things online.
Joanne's gonna do the intro, but before we start, I wanted to say Amy is our inaugural, we don't actually have a real name for this yet, but like Pediatric Health Services Research Fellow Exchange Program, potentially. What we really mean is that Amy's coming here from IU as a fellow and Joanne's going to IU in 2 weeks. So we're trying to develop this as a pilot program and think about how we can support fellows as they go onto job markets and things like that. And also, you know, we don't get as many opportunities to give talks and visit places, honestly, after the pandemic, especially because so many things are virtual. So trying to emphasize the in-person aspect of meeting folks. So Amy, we all went to dinner at Aventura last night and had really brilliant paella, and is going to be meeting with a bunch of faculty members. So that's kind of the background of how Amy got here, and I'll give it to you for the introduction.
So Dr. Amy Hanson is a third-year PICU fellow at Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis and Indiana, and she is doing a concurrent Children's Health Services Research Fellowship along with her PICU training. And today she will be talking to us about her journey to this CHSR and the basis for her fellowship project. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Amy. I'm laughing. You guys are all Dr. Hanson. It's Amy. So I am at IU in Indianapolis, which conveniently is less than 4 hours from here. For those who didn't know, I didn't know that till yesterday. And then I'm actually doing, so during my third year of PICU fellowship, I'm also doing a 1-year health services research fellowship, which is, I'm learning very different from yours here and a lot newer. And so I'm excited to learn more about what you guys do here versus what we do there. But basically it's just getting a ton of research experience, getting some good mentorship and learning what health services research is. And so I'm very new to the health services world, like 6 months in. And so I'm just going to talk to you about how I got here. So objectives for today, I'll give you my story up until this point, and we won't go from my birth. We'll start from maybe med school. And then I'll tell you about the research that I've had time to do with all the clinical training, and then where I'm going to go from here. So instead of getting into the depth of each project, I'm just going to touch on kind of what I've done, why I did it, and where we're going next. So start of my story, I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and their claim to fame is that you can have multiple 1,000-year floods in a few years. So it's a great place. But that took me about 35 minutes east to University of Iowa. I wanted to stay close to home. And so Iowa City is where I did my undergrad and med school. And in-state tuition is what kept me there for medical school. So during undergrad, my academic counselor said, you know, what do you enjoy outside of the sciences? Because that's what we're going to focus on for your kind of fun classes to keep you well. And I said Spanish. And so he said, okay, well, why don't you get a Spanish minor? And so started taking those classes, ended up getting a Spanish major because I loved it. And that kind of fueled this passion for public and global health. So started volunteering as a Spanish interpreter for our Iowa Free Mobile Clinic, basically working with a bunch of family med docs to provide care for people who can't get it elsewhere, working out of like laundry rooms in the middle of migrant worker camps and things. And so that was a cool experience. Then I ended up working for a HRSA center called Proteus. And so they provide healthcare to southern Texas and northern Mexico migrant workers who come up for the summer. It's really like May through September in Iowa. So these people get dropped off on a bus, they get nothing. In terms of healthcare resources, they have no vehicle. It's a food desert, so lots of issues there. And so worked with this company to help give them everything, including healthcare. And so started seeing that this was a really marginalized and kind of invisible population with essentially no rights here. And so ended up talking to the head of my global health program at Iowa that I was a part of. And she said, you know what, Amy, why don't you, if this is your passion, looking at this type of population, why don't you change your global health focus and focus all the global health principles locally and call it like local health? And so I did a global health distinction track during med school at Iowa, and my whole thing for my thesis was that you can take global health principles and apply them locally. And it's arguably more important to do that because if we have populations here, we don't need to fly to Africa to change the world before we fix it here. And so that's what I worked on. So ended up finding another invisible population. Oh, I just realized you guys can't see this. Slides advancing for me, but not up here. Does anybody know how to troubleshoot that?
Steve is over here.
I drag.
It's moving.
Well, okay, it's not important. They're just icons. But so started working with Indian Health Services in Montana and lived out there for a few months. And that was an experience living on the reservation and saw that like the migrant farm worker population, those people had essentially no rights to any of the resources that we have through our government with the sovereign nation. It was just really tricky to get them like subspecialty services, especially in the world of pediatrics. And so kind of similar experiences to migrant farm workers. And then because it was a global health track, I technically had to do something global health. So went to Guatemala. You can come in and do whatever. It's advancing for me. So I can see advancing, but it's not advancing up here. All these troubleshooting, so yeah, went and spent a few months in Guatemala and worked with the populations there. And so it's just, it was really cool to me that, and really sad that if you look at all the global health things people do abroad, you can do all that work here. And so that is what brought me to what ended up taking me to IU. So IU had a really well-established relationship with AMPATH. And AMPATH is a basically a global health partnership with places abroad. And so I wanted to continue to do global health work, and IU was a good opportunity to do that. Thank you. And then on top of that, IU had a really cool physician scientist program, and that's what ended up taking me there for residency was that I could get this advanced research training. And basically their physician scientist track was made for non-PhDs to get some experiences with grant writing, how to put together, you know, a research bio sketch, how to put together spec aims, those sorts of things. A lot more basic than all the PhDs in this room. Training. And so went to IU for the global health and the physician scientist track. And then I stayed there for fellowship because I loved all my research mentorship. Thanks. And can I be in presenter mode?
Yes.
My dog. You guys can skip this part on the recording online. Don't be doing that, but it is that easier.
Yeah. As long as it advanced, that looks great. Yeah.
We just put it in presenter mode from online.
Well, there, I'm sorry for that.
Sorry, guys. Causing problems. My lifestyle. In a nutshell. Okay, so, did all this work, found out all this cool stuff about myself and the US and the sad kind of state that we were in terms of a lot of populations were being missed. In all of our initiatives at the national level, and all that came out of that was a poster, because I did not realize that research it was important to publish your work. And so I did all this work and had no idea what I was doing, and had not sought out appropriate mentorship. And so had not sought out appropriate research mentorship, and so didn't have a lot in terms of a CV to show for it. Ended up though being inducted into Gold Humanism, thank you, Gold Humanism Honor Society. And winning an Excellence in Public Health Award. And so I knew I was doing good work, but I just didn't have anything to show for it. So went to IU, oh, wow, by going off script, I skipped some things. So ended up, I pulled from my thesis statement, from my global health thesis, this statement, and basically it just encompasses what I am ending up wanting to do now. So it turns out that 7 years ago, me knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know it. But I wrote as my conclusion of my thesis that as future physicians, I think it's our duty to advocate for healthcare as a right and to challenge the quality of that healthcare, especially for the invisible populations. And recognizing the inequality and barriers to healthcare abroad are comparable to invisible populations here. And this is going to be an upward battle that we're going to be fighting in this whole concept of global health. And so this is kind of my stitch and what I want to do with my life. And I knew that 7 years ago, and I just had to come around to it again. So at IU, came for AMPATH, came for this physician scientist program, and then COVID happened. And so everything I thought I was going to be able to do with it, go to Kenya, do all this really cool POCUS work, health equity work, didn't happen because of COVID. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about the lessons I've learned from prior research throughout this journey, and then I'll get to what I want to do with it. So biggest one was the power of being flexible and how important that is. And a lot of that came from COVID and having to pivot. Importance of strong mentorship and establishing that early. Scientific writing and presentation skills, various methodological experience and skills, some grant writing skills, and then the importance of support at home to make all this happen. So I'm being flexible. So obviously most of my training, I started my residency training in 2019, and later 2019, early 2020 is when COVID happened. So I happened to be on the unit for most of COVID because I was deemed one of the young people with no kids that was safe to go see all the sick people. And so I was on the wards, ended up just publishing a case report. Like there was nothing really in the literature about neonates and how they responded to COVID. And so we added COVID to our differential diagnosis for Brew, and we thought that was important to publish. And then I was interested in looking at medical student education during all of this because I was fresh out of med school. And the medical students had been banned from the wards due to all this uncertainty. And so I wanted to see what that did to their education. So I looked at their shelf exam scores, and they had gone down significantly. And I was presenting that at one of our education meetings and with leadership, and they said, Amy, you should really publish this data. So that was my first taste of, oh, when I'm doing all these things, I should probably publish them. So in the midst of all of this, I was tied up with I really liked our nephrology group there. And so I was supposed to be in a lab looking at glomeruli and slides and things. But when COVID happened, obviously, there were rules about what could and could not be done in person. And if you weren't doing COVID research, you could not be in a lab. So that lab pivoted and did COVID antibody research, which I had very little interest in pipetting and doing all that stuff again. But I ended up pipetting and running ELISAs all day. And in doing that, because I was flexible and kind of open to opportunities, one of the nephrologists said, hey, you actually care about health equity and that sort of work. I have this data set with all the COVID patients across the state. Do you want to do something with this data? So Michelle Starr handed me a big data set of COVID cases across the state. And I ended up taking that data and looking at variation in the diagnosis by zip code. It was just a simple cross-sectional cohort study looking at race, ethnicity, zip code in terms of COVID diagnoses. I ended up geolocating that data using zip codes, and most of the data was from Marion County, where Indianapolis is, and the surrounding counties. And then just did some descriptive analyses, normalized it for 10,000 persons, and found some pretty alarming data that is not news to anyone in this room. Basically, in this cross-sectional cohort study of a pretty representative sample of the state of Indiana and representative of the Midwest as a whole, zip codes with higher percentages of residents who were African American, Hispanic, foreign born, living in poverty, living in more dense areas. All of those people were more at risk of COVID. And so at the time, this was new and novel data, and it came out along with around the same time as a big review came out, of course. But this was doing what I actually wanted to do, and it was because I was flexible that I was able to do this. So pivoting into transitioning away from flexibility to how critical effective mentorship is. So in Iowa, did all this work with public and global health, and really only had a couple posters to show for all that work. And most of that was me just not knowing, one, how critical it is to publish, and two, how critical it is to find a good mentor. And so it wasn't until I entered this more structured research curriculum at IU through Morris Green that I realized that and started to be kind of academically productive. And so when I decided I wanted to pursue PICU fellowship, I went to my current fellowship director, who was obviously just a PICU attending at the time, to me as a resident. And I said, hey, I'd really like to do this, but I don't have any publications in this space. Can we come up with something quick? And in an hour, we had a project, an idea of who would be on kind of the panel of experts in the field to help me complete that project, a timeline, expectations were set, and we had talked about how we wanted to communicate with each other. And so that was, it helps that she's also a part of the board of my physician scientist program. But that was, I walked out of that meeting mind blown by how much can get done when you're on the same page with your mentor and you set all your expectations ahead of time. So in less than a year, we came up with this project and had it published. And I think that just, I mean, it was a very simple study, but had some pretty cool implications. And it was because of establishing everything right off the bat that we were able to get it done. And so for anyone who is familiar with cardiac ICU, basically when you're in pediatric ICU training, you spend a decent amount of time in cardiac ICUs depending on your program. And so, but the programs are not homogeneous by any means. And so your volume of cases that you're going to see are very dependent on your institution and the number of fellows. And so it was pretty alarming to see that all PICU fellows who graduate are not the same in their cardiac experiences. And it very much justifies the need for more training if you want to call yourself a cardiac intensivist in this day and age. Then continuing on with the importance of effective mentorship. So after I did that study and saw how productive you can be when you have good mentorship, I was like, I have to stay here. I found great people here. They can make me successful. And so this was actually my fellowship project for my PICU fellowship. We did a prospective study year-long looking at extubation failure in neonates and young infants. Basically, if you put in endotracheal tube in, a breathing tube, and hook them up to a ventilator, when you take it out, what are the odds you have to put it back in? And so Chris Master-Pietro was someone who was on that panel from that survey study I did. And he said, I would love to be your mentor. I think we can get a prospective study done if we started a little early. And so similar to my experiences with Courtney Rowan, he said, okay, what's our timeline? A prospective study is not going to be easy to do while you're in PICU fellowship, so let's lay it out. Then of course I decided to have a baby, so that was fun to work that into the timeline. But we were able to get this done and published so I can talk to you guys about it before I'm done with PICU fellowship. And so it's not because I'm awesome, it's because I had great mentorship and we had a timeline and we stuck to it. And so was able to use a lot of the skills like putting together an IRB protocol start to finish, putting together a red cap, testing that red cap, and then took those skills from the survey-based study. And on top of that, learned how to effectively screen a census every day, how to prospectively enroll patients, how to troubleshoot, you know, how much data can I get from other sources versus how much do I have to collect myself, and trying to keep up with the prospective data entry so that it remained a prospective study. And so learned a lot along the way from this paper. I do not want to be an expert in extubation failure, but I have read a lot about it. And again, some really cool findings that are relevant to the field and not relevant to what I want to do. But we ended up of course, we said, our extubation failure rates are really high. We want to evaluate that. And as soon as I started looking at it, our extubation failure rates went way down. And so then we had to pivot the point, the purpose of the study. And we ended up finding that when kids need that breathing tube back in terms of like temporarily, when they have to have it put back in, is related to the etiology. And so kids who needed that breathing tube put back in right away tended to have upper airway obstruction and swelling from that breathing tube, whereas the kids who needed it later tended to have residual cardiac lesions and things after their repair. So still some really cool findings, even though it didn't have anything to do with the impetus for the study. So strong mentors, I think, are really good at setting expectations for both parties up front. They're good at establishing authorship early, so the expectations are clear. You have a mutually agreed upon timeline and a discussion of how you're gonna talk about it if you're not meeting that timeline. Communication expectations and planning, even as simple as, are we gonna text each other? Are we gonna call each other? Are we gonna have scheduled meetings? How are we gonna do this? And just learning that it takes a village. So when we found some pretty cool genetic findings and things in our study, we said, okay, we need a geneticist on board with this project. And so just realizing that you don't have to have all of the expertise for everything you want to look at. So learned a lot. In terms of writing and presentation skills over the past few years. So this project, basically I was looking at extubation failure in the cardiac ICU population, and where my heart is, it's in nephrocritical care, if I had to pick a clinical niche. And so my mentor, Michelle Starr, knew this about me and said, why don't we take advantage? Steve Gorga here is huge into WeRock, so I'm sure you guys have heard about it. But basically it's it's the largest multinational study looking at pediatric dialysis patients. And she said, why don't you submit an ancillary proposal looking at extubation failure reintubation in this population? And so I'd never done anything like that before. And that was a neat opportunity. And I've learned a lot from this project. So I presented it at various places, took it to AKI-CRT, took it to PAS, had a platform presentation, presented it at my grand rounds at my institution. And in the course of examining the data over and over again for these different presentations, I've realized the limitations of looking at taking a question and asking it to a registry that the registry wasn't designed to answer that question. And so there are a lot of limitations that come with that. And we've had a lot of kind of trips along the road and are basically restructuring. So initially we had taken this data and we said, well, this is crazy that race may play a role in extubation failure. And on reworking the analysis, actually we had an entire manuscript written and the writing committee said, did you take into account terminal extubations? So kids that you take out that breathing tube with no intention of putting it back in. And we said, well, no, we did not look at that. And when we looked at that, we found out that most of the extubations in this cohort were terminal. So we were not capturing all the extubation failures because a lot of the kids that would have failed, we had already preliminarily agreed we were not going to put them back in. And so then it's a whole different paper, right? Of, okay, why are we terminally extubating these kids? Should they have ever gotten dialysis in the first place? And so learned a lot through this project of, wow, you really have to be critical of your own data. And so we are rewriting the entire manuscript right now and restructuring it. And it's actually turning out to be a lot more fun than work. So this has not come to fruition, but I've still learned a ton from it. Also with scientific writing and presentation skills, quality improvement. So entirely different science and important in, especially as someone who's primarily a clinician. I started looking at the beginning of my fellowship, communication in our unit. And I was focusing on limited English proficiency families because I was working with another co-fellow who had wanted to look at communication as a whole. And I said, I'll take this piece of it and this is going to be the piece I own. And so put together a key drivers diagram because that's what you do in quality improvement. And so our goal was to be to increase compliance with communication, daily communication every day, particularly with the limited English proficiency families in their preferred language. And so primary drivers for that, we knew that communication between our team members and families was a key focus area for our division. We were not doing a great job. And that language barriers and communication issues with interpreters kept coming up. And so a lot of it was we didn't have enough like video interpreter devices or the phone interpreters weren't available, those sorts of things. We had no standard process for how to communicate with these families. And at that point, the hospital was forming a language access committee as a whole, so that was a good opportunity to jump on board with that. And we knew we needed to optimize our language services and kind of centralize things so people knew where to go, and how to get an interpreter at any time of day. And so our change ideas, we ended up co-designing. So we met with a bunch of families and said, you know, what would be a good way to communicate with you in this busy unit, not knowing when we say we'll come back at 10 and then a code happens, we weren't there at 10. And so how can we better communicate with you? And after we met with probably 20 families, they said, why don't you just designate, we kind of co-designed, but they said, why don't you designate one person who circles back with us, who's maybe not the head of the team, to make sure that our questions are answered and things. So we called that a communication champion. Ended up joining forces with our standardized rounds committee, because we've been working, attending to attending. Our rounds were very different, depending on the week, and so were the communication styles. So we said, okay, communication kind of needs to be tied into a new standardized rounds template. I went ahead and joined our language access committee, advocated for some new video interpreter devices and found the funding for that. And then we ended up adding a consult to interpreter services order into our PICU admission order set. So lots of different ideas that we ended up doing all of them, to try to make this better. So with QI, you need a run chart. So this is just a run chart of our communication champion and how we were doing. So overall, we put together the standardized rounds template. We told the residents who are our workforce, I'm assuming probably somewhere to here, that this was something we were working on doing. And it wasn't until we started emailing the attendings on service every week to say, hey, we really need to do this. We need to make this a priority, every single week, that we started to see people do this on rounds. And so I had a couple of sneaky auditors on rounds who were making sure this was happening. As soon as we stopped emailing and kind of harassing the attendings to get on board with this, things fell off. And then once we started reminding them, things got back on track. But just because we were assigning someone to talk to families on rounds doesn't mean it was happening. So then we started auditing kind of our huddle in the afternoon to say, are people actually following through with this? And it turns out they were. So people have been talking to families in their preferred language. This was screening for all the families getting their communication, but 84% of these families were actually limited English proficiency. So it was happening and we were doing a good job. So we have not yet published this either, but this is again part of my passion, and we're working on a manuscript for this as well. Probably my proudest moment in fellowship was I decided, you know, it doesn't matter if we feel like we're doing a good job, do the families feel like we're doing a good job? So this part came as I started to get my health services training, and realizing that was the real how I should actually be doing things. And so we sat down with 16 families and said, you know, do you feel like you're being regularly communicated with in your preferred language? Do you understand why your child is here? Do you understand why we're doing what we're doing? And are the nurses doing a good job? Are we as physicians doing a good job? Are we identifying ourselves? And overall, are you satisfied? And 100% of those families said, yes, we are satisfied and you guys are doing a good job. And so we felt really good that not only did we feel like we were doing a good job and our auditing said we were doing a good job, but the family said we were doing a good job. And so I think this is when I first started to see what health services research really is. And so again, getting back to the point, presenting QI work is very different from presenting, you know, hardcore lab science and those sorts of things. And so I was able to present this project as part of our QI competition. We have kind of, you pick the 4 winners and you present it at grand rounds. And so learning how to present this and talk through this was a different learning experience. Anyone who's going to SCCM, if you want to skip a day in Disney World and hear the talk, I'm going to make it better for SCCM. Getting into scientific methods, I'm laughing because my scientific methods experience is going to be a lot different than the PhDs in the room, so you could just humor me here. But I feel like as a PICU fellow, learning case reports and case series, one, they're really dangerous because sometimes people take that and run with it, but have been able to publish a few of those and get that experience. Have gotten to do some survey-based studies, the cross-sectional cohort COVID study, the retrospective chart reviews, which the reason they aren't presented here is because they never came to fruition, because wow, there's a lot of roadblocks with retrospective chart reviews. Power of a prospective cohort study, this multinational collaborative work with WeRock, and then quality improvement. So for a clinician, I feel like this is a pretty good base and representation of the different methodologies. In reading all of your bios last night, it is by no means representative of everything in the world that there is to do with methods. But great writing skills, so I've learned that you have to write them and get them refused to get anywhere, and so I took a couple shots at our Women for Riley grants. These are all internal grants, because that's what's feasible as a fellow. And I had a couple of what I thought were really cool ideas that they didn't think were as cool as I did. But ended up applying for the critical care research grant this year for my health services project, looking at social drivers of health in asthma patients, and was able to get this grant to pay for a lot of my data. And so just getting practice with the experience of writing grants, getting the letters and things, and then dealing with the rejection has been a good learning experience. So my fellowship project is, I'm working with Dr. Colin Rogerson, and I've met some of you through him. And so he is a big data informatics guy. And so his niche is asthma. So I wanted to look at social drivers of health in patients getting hospitalized for asthma and do the kind of trendy geomarker work that people are doing. And I wanted to get that experience with him. So chose him because he was a good mentor. He's got this experience, and I wanted it before I graduated as a fellow. And the reason I'm not going to talk to you about it today is because we just got the data last Wednesday and I have not gotten to go through it yet. But we were able to use IMPC as a big database that covers all the data in the state of Indiana. And so it's really nice. It's not just going to be IU or our county hospital Eskenazi. It's going to be most of the patients in the state. About 2/3 of the patients are represented in this database. So should be pretty cool to see the more rural places and how they handle asthma. These study aims are to determine the influence of specific social and environmental factors on the frequency of and escalation for pediatric patients presenting to ERs in Indiana with acute or critical asthma. Acute being those who go to the floor and critical being those who go to the PICU. And then the second aim will be to determine which publicly available composite predictive measures are most closely correlated with asthma patients' hospital readmission rates. And so basically, you guys, I'm sure, are all familiar with the area deprivation index, with the social vulnerability index, with the childhood opportunity index, and there are nuances to each of those. And no one's ever looked at which one is the best specifically in the pediatric population. Some of them get more granular with the different socioeconomic data that they pull with like depending on where they pull their census data. Whereas the childhood opportunity index specific for kids and renewable every year. So which one is the best and which one's going to be the most representative of social determinants of health in kids? No one's looked at that. And so we're hoping to get that from this data. A small potatoes study with not a lot of implications for what do we do with the data, because this is a 1-year health services fellowship for me and it needed to be done and published in that year. But we have some cool ideas of where to go with it thereafter. So presented this data at policing in the social determinants of health subgroup. And we are going to present it hopefully at PAS this year if they accept my whip with no data, so we'll see. So TBD on the data that comes out of this. Importance of support at home. So you can't do any of this stuff if you don't have someone else managing your household, in my experiences. And so my husband is basically a rock star single dad a lot of the time, and my dog is a great emotional support animal. So this is my family. So future direction. This kind of all came about in the past couple of weeks in interviewing various places and talking to folks about the health services experiences elsewhere. I figured out what I want to do finally. So what I want to be when I grow up is an expert in equity at the end. And so I have so many questions, looking at when we transition our goals of care. So when we say, you know what, we were being super aggressive and now we need to transition to more of a comfort care approach. We are not going to be able to heal you all the way. How can we make you comfortable? Who should be involved in those conversations? When should we initiate them? And how should we do that? Especially with people who don't speak English, people who can't be at the bedside. Looking at discussions, escalation of extracorporeal support. So when we're talking about heart and lung bypass or dialysis, at what point should we be offering those versus not? And how do we talk about those to patients who had never been in a hospital before this hospitalization with an interpreter? Transitioning goals of care when you've already done these aggressive things. So, okay, now you're on blood thinners, you're on heart and lung bypass, you're on dialysis, and we need to talk about stopping. How do we do that? And how do we describe what that death is going to look like to families who already had no idea what this stuff was coming in? So how do we do this with the families who aren't there, with the families who don't speak English? And how do we use our social work and palliative care folks to do this more effectively? When do we involve them and how do we do it? And so started looking into the literature, and shared decision-making, I think, is what I'm gonna have to go into. So this was a paper from 2018, published in Pediatrics, and it looked at the concept of shared decision-making. Basically goes through its history and proposed this model that balances patient autonomy with patient's best interest, physician guidance, importance of informed decisions for the family, for the patient. In pediatrics, this is especially important. So this highlights how pediatrics is different from adult medicine, and that in pediatrics, you have surrogate decision makers kind of by default. And so for young children, the decision making most often falls on parents and guardians, and there's emotional components that feed into that. There's guilt. Adolescents, what do you do with them when they should probably be making their own decisions, but they don't technically have the capacity yet? So it gets really complex in pediatrics, especially in end-of-life care. And so it talks a lot too about the best interest principle versus substituted judgment. So in kids, surrogate decision makers, the principles that guide those decisions are even different. So this is a whole can of worms that I would love to open specifically as it relates to end of life, and not a lot of people have done that in kids. The other thing is looking at barriers to pediatric shared decision making and how to overcome those. So that's something I would like to do. So there is no unified approach to shared decision making in pediatrics, and there's a lot of barriers for obvious reasons. Some of those being we don't have a lot of time when they're in ICU and kids are dying. The emotional state of the parents, you know, if they're coming in, especially if they're coming in and they're getting sicker and they're rapidly decompensating, how do you kind of establish rapport and work on shared informed decision-making as a child is actively dying in front of your eyes? We make a lot of assumptions of what parents can and can't handle as providers, and there's no training on how to avoid doing that. And so talking about how we can train physicians to do this better, and how we can fix some of the kind of systemic barriers of time, of limited providers, of interpreter services and things. So there's a lot of stuff we could do with this, particularly at end of life in the ICU. Various studies in adults came out in the early 2000s trying to look at potential like racial and cultural and gender variances in how we discuss end of life care. These studies, again, were all in adults, and they were all 20 plus years ago, and medicine has changed a lot since then. And so I think we kind of need to start from scratch, especially in the pediatric population, to start figuring out some of these questions. So equity at the end. Where exactly do I want to go? So I want to get into the stuff nobody wants to talk about. I want to look at health equity at the end. I want to look at shared decision-making, how we make that equitable for the families, particularly those not at the bedside and those who don't speak English. And people have started to look at this, but people haven't delved into it too much. So there's a nice systematic review looking at goals of care communication in the PICU, and it's beautiful. And it says, we talked to a bunch of white English-speaking people, and this is what they want. But no one's really looked at it for non-English, non-white patients. And so that's where I want to start. So I'd like to apply for an ARC, a PCOR grant, a KO8 in the next couple of years. And so IU has Research Jam. It's basically an implementation science group that helps you to set up focus groups and those sorts of things around the community. And they do a really nice job of it. So I'd like to partner with them to explore cultural preferences and beliefs surrounding end-of-life decision-making. These aims, by the way, are very much still being refined. Second aim will be something along the lines of developing and implementing a culturally sensitive, adaptable decision aid to support shared decision-making and end-of-life care across an increasingly diverse patient population. So we have a lot of decision aids available, again, in adults, but nothing in kids and nothing standardized. So I think that's where I'm hoping to go with this. And that's the intervention I'm hoping to eventually achieve. But I want to co-design that with the community and the patients it's going to affect. Future direction, I would love to look at the physician side of how do we handle our emotions? You know, there are people who say, you're an ICU physician, you can never cry in front of a family. Some families want to see you cry. And I've gotten that feedback of, you know, you seemed like you didn't care about my child when you were telling me. So it's very different in how you're supposed to handle your emotions and how you're supposed to tailor your responses during end of life. And I would love to delve into talking to families about what they want to see in their physician and then training physicians for how to do that. And then what happens to these families after? So their child dies, they leave the hospital, and then we don't have any sort of follow-up structure to talk to these families. I'm sure they're not okay. I would not be okay if my daughter died. So working to have some sort of standard communication, follow-up regimen that is culturally sensitive and appropriate for these families, keeping in mind that some of them don't have phones, don't have internet, need interpreters. And so how do we go about that? And so I think this could give me a full career of questions and answers to work toward. So career development timeline, because we're supposed to have one, my, approximate 5-year plan, 3-year plan. That is obviously gonna change. I am positive after I take my first job. I wanna publish the ongoing work that I'm doing. I wanna get an MPH, and I'm trying to figure out exactly, I'm hoping to talk to some of you guys today about what sort of MPH is most appropriate for someone who's not PhD trained, but wants to be well-spoken in this space. I want to apply for loan repayment. I think that's a good start for a big NIH grant writing experience. I would like to pass my critical care medicine boards, and then I want to apply for this art grant. I have a lot of acknowledgements for people who are and are not up here, who have gotten me here. And sorry, that was kind of all over the place with our technological difficulties, but what questions do people have that I can maybe answer? Go ahead.
How did you decide to do the fellowship concurrently with your PICU fellowship? And knowing that you had like a family and all these other commitments, like, can you just talk a little bit about like your decision-making process, how you went through it?
Yeah, I was sitting at home working on my fellowship projects, and my nephrology mentor messaged me and said, hey, do you have a minute? And the fellowship director for health services research popped up on my screen, and it was an interview. And he said, hi, I heard you're interested in our health services research fellowship. Let's talk about it. And I didn't know what health services was. And so I had kind of a surprise interview thrown on me because she had spoken highly of my research productivity capabilities. And I started asking questions, what is health services? And as we started to have these discussions, he's like, oh, this is the stuff you care about. You just didn't know what health services was. And so our health services fellowship took a hiatus with COVID, and they were trying to start it back up, but they wanted to make sure their first fellow they took was going to be able to publish and show that it's worthwhile. And so I kind of fell into it, and they worked with my PICU fellowship director to make that happen. My division chief in the ICU space also really wanted someone tied into health services because our health services department has a good track record of getting funded. And he's looking for more of that in our department. And so he was very supportive of it because I still do 20 weeks of service and like 50 calls this year. And so it's been a lot of both sides being good team players and supporting me in doing this. So it kind of got thrown in my plate and I was excited about it. So happenstance.
Thanks.
Just as a heads up in the chat, there are some comments, excuse me, about using digital technologies and mobile tech in research with high-risk adolescent populations, including non-English speaking. And then also a comment, I will be completing my PhD soon and will be looking for postdoc fellowships. Any advice that you have in looking for one?
Ooh, okay. So first question is use of technology in this.
There is like a comment with, and I'll copy and send you the link. There were just some information and some resources that I'll send you from the chat.
Okay, I was like, I would love that. So from that standpoint, people within our health services group are working on developing apps for other things. But I've actually gotten tied in with the School of Design because our schools are pretty good at talking to each other, which it sounds like your guys's are too. But the design students, when they're working on, basically it's like an engineer when you do your big final project. The design students have been great at working on, they've actually been sitting in and meeting with families and talking about what they want to see on our website and things. And so we've been able to enhance our website. And I'm hoping we could do something with getting some resources together, just when you get admitted to the ICU, handing people a packet, sending them a link to a website, a QR code, whatever it is, providing them an iPad if they don't have a phone to look at these resources and having that all translated. So you can say like, okay, here's what we should expect. Here's how often we should expect to see a physician, what those physicians look like and things. So very open to other ways to use technology because I feel like that's where we're going. In terms of postdoc experiences, I am by no means versed in the PhD world, but in looking for jobs, what I've realized is if you say you're a health services person, and I'm by no means claiming to be an expert in this field I just entered. But if you say you're interested in health resources and health services research, people are very interested in that. There's just not a lot of places that have a central concentration of a multidisciplinary group like you guys do and like IU has. And so while a lot of places are saying, oh my gosh, we'd love to have you come and do this work, most of those places don't have the resources, I don't think, to make you successful in doing that. So I would be very picky about where you go. Because I've had a lot of places say, wow, yeah, come do this. But looking at leaving IU and the resources I have there is very intimidating. Yeah.
I may have missed this, and I apologize if I did, but is there a palliative care service at IU? Because it seems like a lot of the things you're talking about, and I may have missed you talking about your interactions with palliative care. And I apologize if I did, but it seems to me, because there is quite a literature in pediatric palliative care. I mean, it's growing, it's a field, and I was wondering, is that partnerships that you're going to engage?
Yes, so there's actually a nurse practitioner who wants to work with me on this from the palliative care space, and she is on, I'm gonna butcher it, there is a multi-center study right now trying to compile data from this sort of thing. And so that is gonna be, we're working on developing a third aim to get some sort of quantitative data to go into this, and it's gonna be the foundation of my K, and we're hoping to use that, but it's kind of in the works right now. It is not complete. And so she and I, this whole thing came up really a couple weeks ago as I sat down with our entire health services department and molded this idea. But she wants to be a part of it. And then there's a lot of this work specifically in the oncology population. And so I'm hoping I have a few names of people I need to reach out to talk to oncology palliative folks about how to go about this. I think the issue in PICU is that there is a lot of the oncology palliative population they're well tied into palliative services, and our palliative group is great. They are drowning because they need realistically, we should consult them on every patient in our ICU, and that's not feasible for them with the volume we have. And so a lot of my training in ICU has been that we are supposed to be palliative advocates, and so I think we as ICU physicians need to get better palliative training. And so it's kind of a partnership I want to have with palliative to offload them a little bit because we do not have enough palliative care doctors US wide. But yes, and I've been looking a lot at the onc palliative publications. There is not a lot. There's basically two kinds of death is how I'm looking at this. There's the unexpected deaths and the expected deaths. And I feel like we're better at handling the expected deaths, the oncology deaths, the ones that are a long time coming, and the ones that happen quicker unexpectedly, the bad septic shocks, necrotizing fasciitis and things. Those are the kids that are tougher to handle because we don't have that rapport. And do you call palliative right when they're dying and say, hey, can you get in here and establish rapport and handle the goals of care? And so trying to tease out specifically those deaths are the ones that are less studied that I will probably end up focusing on. That was a too wordy of a response, but.
Thank you. I think just on that point, I think there's also like a growing international literature that might be relevant around euthanasia for children. And it's it might be relevant theoretically at least, and it's around issues around shared decision making. And there's like a bioethical, like an ethical literature there too around shared decision making. So I think you'll come up across that, like it's some of your. My question was really around your headline use of the word equity, because it's sort of like in some ways what you're wanting to get. And I wonder with your grant application, in some ways what you want to get at is not equity, like you want equity of experience, but you want a highly individualized journey. So I'm wondering about that use of the word equity really there, because you want equity in the quality of their experience, but you want a highly individualized journey for your people that are like linguistically diverse and culturally diverse. So I guess you don't want the word equity to sidetrack people into thinking that people want the same. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess my question's around the use of that word, particularly as your headline.
Yeah. I liked it. I thought it was kind of snappy because I'm not an acronym person and I feel like a successful study needs a good acronym.
Yeah,
So, but I can.
yeah, I guess think about it from the perspective of your reviewers, like, and equity is one of those words that, like, you ask 50 people, they're going to all bring a different take on what equity means to them. Like, everyone has a different definition and a different experience with the word equity. So I guess think about your panel who are going to be judging your grant and what experience they might bring with the word equity to your grant. Like, and then how that might impact on how they just, their initial judgments of what they bring to that, if it is your headline.
Okay,
Yeah.
And even, I think that's a great point. I think even further to that, where it gets triaged to be reviewed. Oftentimes, if in fact this is going to end up being a grant application, a lot of times words function of which study sections things go to.
okay,
And unless and different people mean different things by equity, and there's some forgiveness there. But I think that the words you choose are very important, not just for as you said, the snappiness of the title,
Yeah.
but for the science behind it.
okay. Man, I was really liking the title, so. This is good feedback. Yeah,
Great, thanks so much for sharing all of this information and especially your decision making about where you've ended up in terms of future directions. I think a couple of comments. One, first, there is literature that Ellen Lipstein at Cincinnati has led on shared decision making applied to pediatric populations that I think would be relevant to your work going forward. I'd also encourage you to think about including culture along with limited English proficiency as the characteristics of the families that you look at, because those will often be correlated, but may have differential impacts on the decision-making process. And then just to give an example of, like, I think you'll have plenty of work to do in the space that you've defined, but you may want to think about broadening this over time. This has actually come up in the newborn screening area where there are conditions that require really limited time to transplant after the newborn screening diagnosis is confirmed. And what has been observed is that there are families who don't make those timelines. Those families tend to look very different and either come from either limited resources, limited English proficiency, a different culture, some combination of those. And so, that is a real issue in terms of equity, and it hasn't been addressed in the newborn screening area. And I think you'll find lots of areas like that.
cool, okay. I can do that.
So there's a lot of utility in what you're
Yeah.
doing.
In starting to dig, I'm like, there are so many places, there's so many directions to go. Yeah, okay.
Amy, great job. I'm actually, whether it's serendipity or just like methodologic robustness, but the second look at the WeRock data to make sure that these were actually terminal extubations rather than, this attempt at extubation, that is critical. And kudos to you and your team, because that was discovered, more than 25 years ago by Maury Pollack, the idea of dying in the ICU, who actually dies. Do you die unexpectedly or is it an expected death? So kudos to you. I just wanted to suggest also, when you sort of think about the idea of death and the experience of death, right? That, the forerunners of the field, right, of critical care focused a lot on death and survival, right? And I know you're writing this K and all, but there's a third arm here. So you talked about the expected death, the unexpected death, but there is the survival with massive consequences. So in the days of meningococcemia, you lost multiple digits, lost the skin and things like that. Then kids that undergo the sort of non-fatal submersion that survive. So those are two conditions, and then the third one is meningitis. But really, as you look at this into the future, that third arm is actually a very large group now in our field. And I would suggest that as you threw up the potential funding opportunities, think about the Physician Scientist Development Program led by Heather Keenan out of University of Utah. Why? Because Kathleen Meir, that you put up there, and Jeff Burns are two of the advisory panel members. And the reason why that is important is what you're looking at is what they've spent their careers doing. So they will be this is just all, bear with me, but they'll be very, very sympathetic towards this as you try to, and it's not a bad idea to have them as external mentors, or if you want to sort of stay distant from them because, they might be involved in looking at it, but it's a 2-year, K-12 kind of funding that, you can talk with Heather at any time. She'll give you an idea of how things are, and then you can decide whether you want to communicate with those other two people. But these are things they've looked at for so long, and our field is one in which we believe we know a lot of things, but this is not an area that we're good at, right? So as you develop that panel, focus less on the critical care people, people like psychologists, psychiatrists, people that have the experience that Kathy Meir and Jeff Burns have within your setting or beyond to help sort of crystallize some of those ideas as you push through. But great stuff, great stuff.
Thanks. I'm laughing because I was interviewing with them and we don't want to move out to Salt Lake, but I was like, can I keep you guys as mentors? Because we started talking. And so, yes, I have been in communication with them, less so in the past couple weeks as I've rehabbed this idea. So I need to reach back out. Thank you.
Amy, can we get you to stop sharing your screen and we'll put up the QR code for the survey? And then Sabine, I think you had one last
I was just
question.
gonna add a little bit, so I'm Sabine, I'm a pediatric nephrologist, both personal friends with Michelle Starr. And so, but my kind of comment was gonna be, when you're thinking about kind of the shared decision-making and obviously the observer versus the person, there's a body of literature, mostly in the kind of regulatory space, about how you define observer-reported outcomes compared to patient-reported outcomes, and there might be something there for you to kind of import into some of the work that you're doing as you're trying to figure out kind of what the parent sees in order to help make a decision versus not.
Okay, good to know. I think I read a little bit about that in the context of like, do you let parents see a code or not? And that was a very interesting and eye-opening experience. A health services researcher did it out of Cincy and she was looking at, and it was very cool. So, okay, good to know. Thanks.
Great. As you walk by, maybe scan the QR code because we can't get it up on there. I've got it up on mine too, so that should work. But thank you so much, Amy. Thanks for, it's gone.
Oh, I was gonna.
We're gonna email it.
Email sounds great.